This lecture addresses the topic of infancy and toddlers, specifically about their growth, development and sense of self. For the purposes of this year, this lecture has been retitled to be specifically on the social and cognitive development of young children in order to inform the essay topic. The focus of this lecture is on the early social and cognitive development of infants and toddlers, with specific reference to the age group 0 to 1 years, their physical, social, emotional and socio-cultural influences, and 0 to 3 years, with transition to childcare and preschool and the gaining of autonomy. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be also introducing the theoretical perspectives of Bowlby and Piaget, as well as reinforcing the writings of Erikson and the behaviourist theorists who talked about classical and operant conditioning. And that material is helpful looking at behaviour management of young children. The focus of tutorials this week is on predictable and unpredictable transitions of infancy and toddlerhood, with a specific focus on attachment, which is one of the first parts of understanding social development. And in tutorials this week, we'll also be looking at the predictable and unpredictable transitions of early parenting. To link back to the first couple of weeks, the physical, social, emotional and socio-cultural influences on infants do contribute to their sense of self and the development ultimately of their identity and self-concept. And by the time they get to any sort of childcare or preschool, normally they are right at that time of forming their identity, because it is a time of significant physical, cognitive and social growth. Now, one thing that I'm not actually going to go into, but just for your information, gender and gender identity is also a very important part of development, particularly social development and personal development. And we don't cover that in this particular course, but you may wish to think how children identify with different genders. And at the moment, in the current belief about child raising, there is a phenomena, and I think it's called gender neutral. So clothes of infants, some parents try deliberately not to gender stereotype their children into girls and boys and related symbols, and that's all about gender. So gender neutral clothing doesn't necessarily identify the child as being a boy or a girl. So that's quite an interesting topic, but it's a big topic in itself. Similarly, we don't talk a lot about trends and identities, but our cultural trends and our historical place in society leads to different practices, and we're going to give you an exercise this week to see whether or not that's impacted on other people's experience of raising their own children. In terms of the nature-nurture debate, you'll find that the different theorists that we look at, many of them focus on the environment and other people in the environment, but it always tends to also come back to biology when we're talking about cognition, because cognition is related to memory, which is related to intelligence, which is related to mental functioning, and all of those aspects of cognition are influenced by the physical health of the person involved. So now we're going to get on specifically to talking about the cognitive and social development of infants and young children. First of all, there is a belief that the early cognitive and social development of children intermingle in a way. We don't quite know whether or not it's the physical world that exists first for babies and then they place people within it, or whether or not all early knowledge could be instead social and derived from interactions with people. Or it could be that development in one domain, such as the physical domain, drives development in the other domains, such as cognitive and social domains. So one of the things that people do agree on is that the environments and experiences of a child do influence their early social and cognitive development. For very young infants, the place of physical development and children meeting their physical milestones is very, very important. In terms of cognitive development, it's important in terms of reflexes and reactions, which very early in life become more purposive. And that's a sign of cognition, when something goes from being a reflex to being a more deliberate act. And a very easy example of that is a baby rattle, that in the first 4 weeks of life, the baby's attracted to the sound, but eventually when it's put into their hand, they learn that the sound's attached to the rattle and they can move the rattle in a very intentional way to make that sound. And that's a sign of cognitive development as well as physical development in being able to hold and move the rattle. Social development of infants and young children is often tied up with characteristics of the caregiver, because social development starts very early in life with the attachments that we form to a primary carer. There are certain aspects of physical growth and development which influence social and cognitive development. So I'll just run through a couple of these now, and you can follow up others in your tutorials this week. First of all, in terms of physical development, the cephalocaudal principle, which is outlined on page 121 of the Hoffnung text, is the tendency for organs, reflexes and skills to develop sooner at the top or head of the body and later in areas further down. So the cephalocaudal principle is an organised pattern of physical growth that proceeds from head to tail. So if you think of a baby in an embryonic state, their head is quite disproportionate to their body. But as infants grow and develop, by the time they reach adolescence, their head is much more in proportion because they have developed from the top to the bottom. The proximo-distal principle is an organised pattern of growth that exhibits the near to far pattern of development, which is that children develop from the inside out. So they develop gross motor skills before they develop fine motor skills, and they crawl before they can walk, and that sort of thing. So the two main principles to explain physical development are these two principles, that children develop from the top to the bottom and from the inside out. And if you remember those physical principles, then it's easier to understand why some infants and toddlers can master some skills but not other skills. Even something like the difference between walking and skipping, which is a more advanced motor activity. Another aspect of the physical world is that all babies are born with a certain temperament, and this is a biological thing. Temperament is the beginning of personality, and it typically refers to the way a young child acts and responds in different situations, and how he or she interacts with caregivers and with strangers. And most children fall into one of three categories of temperament: either easy temperaments, slow to warm up, or difficult. So babies with easy temperaments have regular sleeping times, are easily soothed when upset, and are generally happy and positive. Slow to warm up babies are more hesitant in new situations and with unfamiliar people. But as I said, temperament is something that is usually inherited. And it's interesting though, because many parents of more than one child point to the differences in temperament between their children. So sometimes that inheritance follows a certain familiarity and pattern, and other times it doesn't necessarily. Difficult babies, though, are easily agitated and very sensitive to all sights and sounds. So given that children have different temperaments, parents and other caregivers need to learn how to create the environment that suits their child. You might be happy to know, though, that more than half, 55% of infants, display at least one characteristic of a difficult temperament most of the time, which actually suggests that many of these characteristics are common. 22% of infants, however, display two or more characteristics of difficult babies, and that can be quite challenging, particularly for new parents. In terms of brain development, this is often measured through reflexes, and page 120 takes you through some of the more primitive reflexes that we're born with and that later disappear, and there are other reflexes that we maintain all our life. For example, yawning, shivering, sneezing, those sorts of things. The midwives would be more familiar and interested in the survival reflexes and in the primitive reflexes, but some of them are certainly worth reviewing. The Babinski reflex, when the bottom of the foot is stroked and the infant's toes fan and then curl in, that disappears sometime between the 8th and 12th month. Other reflexes such as the sucking reflex is a survival reflex that allows the infant to survive. So review the reflexes in newborn infants if you're interested in this particular area, because this is often the way that we're able to measure that an infant's brain is working the way it should and transmitting the messages through the spinal cord to the appropriate places. Milestones of development I'm just going to cover briefly in the next slide, but you can find these on page 123 of your text. So there are milestones for when most children can lift their head and then their chest and then sit with assistance and then sit without assistance, etc. Nutrition is an important aspect of early physical development, and there is evidence that breastfeeding contributes to cognitive development as well. So the World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of an infant's life. There are situations when women are unable to breastfeed, and we're not going to go into those in details, but the midwifery students will no doubt become very familiar with the various nuances of lactation and infant feeding. So growth and physical development feeds into brain development, which feeds into cognition. Cognition itself refers to thinking and reasoning ability, and it's the construction of thought processes such as eventually memory, decision making, and problem solving. So it refers to the way an individual thinks, perceives, and gains knowledge of the world as a result of the interaction between the genetic and the learned factors. There are individual considerations in physical development. One of these in early infancy may well be the preterm infant, or a baby born before 37 weeks. These are just some basic gross motor milestones of an infant aged between 0 and 12 months. Not all infants fit this particular pattern, and not all infants necessarily even crawl, but this is just, again, a general guideline to gross motor milestones. In terms of social development and infant mental health, research has demonstrated that these are the sorts of emotions that infants display, and this is the beginning of awareness and relationships with other people. So often between 0 and 4 weeks, there is a recognition of parents, and there is a social smile engaged between the child and their most closest caregivers. At about 3 months, we have the pleasure smile, when the child is interacting with other objects, other people, and other faces. And if you're interested in this area, this has all got to do with infant perception. So infants can only see a short distance for the first couple of weeks, and then their eyesight becomes much sharper, to the point where when they're I think it's approximately 12 months old, it's as sharp as it's going to be in terms of their usual development. By the time a child reaches 4 months, 4 to 6 months, they start to show other emotions: joy, anger, surprise, fear, and ultimately, according to the research that's been done, guilt and shame by the time they're about 18 months old. That would also depend on the sorts of social interactions they have as well. There are certain unpredictable events that can occur in infancy. For the small for dates baby, or the preterm infant born between 37 weeks, there may be exceptions to the normative infant development that we've been discussing so far. But development can be just as consistent and just as measured and just as important for the preterm infant as well. It's also particularly important for a severely premature infant, one born less than 1,000 grams or at 28 weeks or less gestation. And many of these babies, at least well over 80%, go on to live well without any consequences. Others, unfortunately, live with some sort of impairment or disability, but the great majority do extremely well. There are always exceptions to infant development, but there's now work being done on the fact that if you adjust for prematurity within a certain range and under supervision, then premature children can reach their milestones as well sequentially. So they may not walk until they're 3, but eventually most of them are able to meet all their milestones. There are some definitive causes of low for birth weight infants and prematurity, but they're too complicated to go into in this introductory lecture, and many causes have just no known cause. Another unpredictable event in infancy could be a child born with any sort of health condition or illness or failure to thrive. If this is representative of any sort of neuropsychological disorder, then an early presentation could be failure to thrive, failure to gain weight, failure to respond, and those sorts of things. So this is one of the reasons why infants have regular health checkups. The rest of this lecture is now going to focus on the cognitive and social development of infants and young children. And for this discussion of cognitive development, I'm going to draw on the work of Jean Piaget, who offers one of the most comprehensive descriptions and explanations of cognitive development over the lifespan. Piaget stated that the ability to understand develops gradually as a child grows, and he concluded that cognitive development involves changes of growth in the amount of information as well as differences in the manner of thinking. So according to Piaget, infants between 0 and 2 years of age begin life thinking in terms of sensory perceptions, what they perceive and think about the world around them, and motor actions, by doing things to and with the objects around them. And Piaget called this stage the sensory motor stage. In the sensory motor stage, there are significant changes before and after 8 months of age. So for the purposes of this particular lecture, I'm not going to go into the 6 different stages of sensory motor development, because we're going to look at Piaget's theory as a whole in following weeks. So you don't have to learn the different stages of Piaget's sensory motor stage in terms of early reflexes to symbolic thought. But broadly speaking, babies before 8 months have a psychological makeup that's often restricted to reflexes and reactions that have been built up from these initial reflexes. So a young baby will suck if given the right stimulus, and eventually be able to look at interesting sights and will be able to reach for things that appear interesting. Before 8 months, there are limits on early reactions that children have. They may show some more reaction to one object as opposed to the other, but often there isn't any difference really between people and the world, or people and objects, apart from the immediate caregivers. Before 8 months, however, there's an important process that prepares children for experiencing things through their senses and linking bits of a confusing world together. And this is called intermodal perception, which refers to the way that different sensations are combined to form a perception of something. For example, lip movements are closely coordinated with the sound of a voice, and the look of a mother's face is often coordinated with a certain way of her touching her infant or approaching her infant. And so eventually infants put all these things together and can name processes and concepts and things that are a bit more than just an object. So it leads into the development of language and social processing and allows infants to predict the world. And between 8 and 12 months, many babies show distress at separation from the primary caregiver. And this is sometimes referred to as stranger anxiety. And it's a perfectly normal part of cognitive development, but it's also a very normal part of social development and indicates secure attachment to a primary carer. Another thing that happens after 8 months, or around about the time of 8 months, is that children develop object permanence, and that's a feature of the sensory motor stage. And object permanence is a belief that objects exist separately from their own actions and continue to exist even when they cannot be seen. So an infant will look for an object even after it's disappeared if they have obtained the cognitive state of object permanence. According to Piaget, the belief that people and things continue to exist even when we can't experiencing them directly is called object permanence. So once a child has achieved object permanence, you can play peekaboo with them, you can play hide the block with them, and sometimes you can play a very abbreviated version of hide and seek, because they know that even though you've disappeared, you're going to come back again, and that makes them happy. But before 8 months, they haven't quite got that. There are other features of early infant cognition and sensory motor intelligence, and these are listed on page 141 of the Hoffnung text. From early reflexes to symbolic thought, the sensory motor stage is a very rich stage of cognitive development. Children start off often learning through trial and error, and eventually are able to put difficult combinations together. Schemas, or a scheme, was a representation of ideas or actions. So when we talk about a child's scheme, we're talking about what they actually understand in the moment. Assimilation and accommodation are two terms that we will talk about in further lectures, but basically this develops slowly through the sensory motor stage, and it peaks during the pre-operational stage, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. Assimilation refers to the process where children understand new concepts in terms of things that they already know. So I'm just looking for an example. And here's one. 2-year-old Dot sees a train for the first time and shouts, "Look, Daddy, there's a car." And her father explains that the train, like a car, is another form of transport in a simple way appropriate to a 2-year-old. So when Dot calls the train a car, she's demonstrating assimilation. She knows what a car is, and she's identified another mode of transport as a car, but she doesn't know the word car. When she learns the word car, when she learns the word train and is able to distinguish between a car and a train, she has been able to accommodate. So assimilation and accommodation are important processes in language development, and I'll also talk about those in a later lecture. But it is something that can start to happen earlier than Piaget actually suggested. So it's a part of infant cognition that could start to happen before 2 years, particularly if children are already speaking before 2 years, which sometimes happens. Another feature of infancy and early cognition, and something that can impact on cognition, is parenting practices and the use of reinforcement. So we can encourage children's cognitive development. Piaget didn't actually say that we could do that specifically. It was another theorist called Vygotsky, who I'll mention in a later lecture. Other factors which influence cognitive development are certain studies that have been done on children between the age of 0 and 2, on their brain development, their linguistic development. And one interesting study that's been done has demonstrated that one factor that can influence the cognitive development of children is their exposure to a dual language. So a dual language is a child exposed to 2 languages during childhood, and bilingualism is if they then learn to speak and often to write that second language. But both of these experiences are seen to be very positive. It's unclear exactly which area of cognition is improved by bilingualism. Amusingly enough, there's one area in which bilingual children showed no more advanced skills than non-bilingual children, and that was in their response inhibition, or in other words, their ability to delay gratification. So that's very, very interesting, or at least I thought it was very interesting, that although bilingual children, it seemed to have a very positive effect on their cognition, and they can learn faster in both languages than a child that's only exposed to one language. The one area of behaviour where all children appear to be very similar is in that ability to delay gratification. And I think that's something that all parents struggle with. But that's one example of something in part 2 of the essay. If you were to look at bilingualism, there's been a lot of studies done on the impact of that on cognition. But that's just one example for you to think about.
So moving on now to the social development of children. Relationships in infancy are often found to vary with the characteristics of the caregiver, because during infancy, infants gain social knowledge from immediate caregivers. They form specific relationships with individual people, and sometimes more than one individual person, and they learn to trust or not to trust, as the case may be. So babies recognise that people carry out actions and show them affection and respond to their looks and their signals and their words. Babies are quite accomplished at various things, so eventually there are different cries that parents recognised, and whilst these are biological, of course, they're also in a sense social, because parents learn to determine whether a child is crying through something like pain or wind or discomfort, or crying through needing affection or food. And there's different sorts of cries. Siblings and relationships with siblings, an extended family, relationships with peers, these are all part of social development. Research that has been done suggests that babies may begin to recognise their parents very quickly. So parents are not imagining it when they become convinced that their baby is responding differently to them within the very first few weeks of life. And an infant will attend to familiar voices and pay attention to these. Many midwives explain that exposure to parental voices actually begins before birth, and this is one reason why we encourage co-parents to talk to their infants while they are still in the womb. In infancy, infants start to understand relationships when they know that their responses will be reacted upon, and when they can express their emotions and develop a sense of safety and security.
A key theorist in the study of infant social development, and sometimes cited in the infant mental health literature, was Bowlby. And the main point of Bowlby's attachment theory was to demonstrate that there's a need for infants to develop a secure relationship with at least one primary carer. The more responsive we are to infants in the first 2 years of life, the more autonomous they will become as adults. As it is, Bowlby's work fed into more recent work about the quality of infant attachments. In terms of attachments, though, it was demonstrated in a study that was done on young children, that worrying was a fairly universal childhood experience that could also tend to impact on the quality of attachments that children form. So, interestingly, research cites that up to 80% of primary school age children reported worrying sometimes, and these were related to school illness, dying, and social problems, but only 6% met the criteria for excessive worry. Children who are in infancy don't tend to start that sort of cognitive process, for example, worrying, until they are in the next stage of development. So not usually up to about 3 years, but certainly after that age. So one of the things that is a mediator, I guess, towards certain different experiences that children might be exposed to is that before the age of 3, they're probably less likely to cognitively process a lot of things that they can process after the age of 3, simply because of the brain development. But getting back to attachments, Bowlby believed that from birth to 2 years, children moved from basically responding to anybody to responding specifically to certain things and growing to understand other points of view and increasing in their ability to form relationships with the people around them. Children in the stage of early childhood often, again socially, transition to childcare and preschool. And your text talks about this in terms of gaining autonomy. So toilet training is often the start of the gaining of autonomy, and starting at childcare or preschool leads to greater interactions. So if a child is exposed to other children at around about 2 years, they have the ability to engage in both symbolic play and cooperative play. There is a lot of gross and fine motor development, and there is also language development and further assimilation and accommodation in learning language. Children in between 0 and 3 years are actually move after the age of 2 into what Piaget called the pre-operational stage of development, which will be covered in further weeks. Children between 0 and 3 are also in Erikson's stage of autonomy versus shame and doubt, which we'll talk more about in tutorials this week. So in summary, there is a lot of cognitive development and a lot of social development that happens between the ages of 0 and 3. Physical development impacts on normative, cognitive and social development. Preterm infants may experience differences in development outside of their usual chronological age and often need to have their milestones adjusted for prematurity, but the great majority go on to thrive. The context and environment seems to impact on normative and non-normative cognitive and social development in different ways. Nutrition, attachments, learning, parenting, early interaction is important as infants and toddlers eventually learn emotional regulation. So many factors, both normative and non-normative, predictable and unpredictable, can impact on the social and cognitive development of infants 0 to 12 months and young children. And that's the conclusion of part 1 of this lecture.